computer. Welcome everybody to another segment of FitFoot U, and I'm honored to have the godfather of biomechanics, Benno Nigg. He's been doing this for almost 50 years, and I would almost say if you don't know him, you'd be under a rock, at least in the physician, podiatry, biomechanics world. However, I think that's part of the issue, is that some people just are not putting as much thought process into biomechanics and doing surgery as the emphasis. Now, I know a lot of good surgeons that do a lot of good techniques, but some of the critical thinking that some of my colleagues, such as Rich Boucher, Doug Ritchie, and of course, biomechanics folks like Simon Bartold and Benno, all contribute to the surgical discipline and principles. So without further ado, Benno, tell us in the big story, and I have a former Olympic athlete too that we're going to get his take on it. What was your thought with the new super shoe controversy with the centimeter too high disqualification of the Ethiopian athlete in Vienna? What happened there in terms of how did he not, did he willfully know he was using a shoe that he shouldn't have? It seems to me that, they signed in with a different shoe. What was your take on that, and in general on the controversy with disqualifying him after the race?
Yeah, I don't know that what he thought and why he did that, and what the company's role was in the whole context. He just had shoes that were not within the limits that were given, and one can argue about these limits, but the limits are there, the rules are there. So he broke the rules, and therefore he was disqualified.
And do you believe that the super shoes that he had, a centimeter over, let's say the next 4 centimeter shoe, was enough to make up that differential of 3 seconds from the second place finisher? Is that entirely within the realm of possibility in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, people think that the thickness of the sole plays a big role. I don't think so. I think that the geometry of the sole, which brings the person more in a position towards the front, plays a bigger role than the material properties of the sole. But that's a personal opinion, and there is no research that can prove one or the other one. So,
right. And the rules are the rules. Well, I have another guest that's just going to briefly give his thought process. He was in the world of swimming. Gary Hall Jr., I call sort of the godfather of swimming. You're the godfather of modern biomechanics. He was able to overcome a diagnosis of diabetes and still end up with a gold medal, and was quite outspoken about doping, and had some technical things that I'm sure every athlete had to deal with when the new, more buoyant bathing suits came out. Gary, are you able to give your thought process on an equal playing field for athletes?
Yeah, I can speak really only to the swimsuit technology that skewed the results tremendously in the sport of swimming. And the swimsuit manufacturers wait until an Olympic year, every quadrennial, to make a big marketing push. The latest technology. We've partnered with NASA to come up with a fabric that mimics the shark skin, or blah, blah, blah. And typically, was there much benefit to it? I usually dismissed it until the suits around 2008. Just before the 2008 trials and Olympics, these speed suits emerged, and what they did was created buoyancy. And the great swimmers in the sport relied upon perfect technique in order to create a planing effect across the top of the water. And what these suits provided was that planing effect without the technique. And so what was a sport that was always a balanced strength to weight ratio suddenly was skewed, and that you had this, especially in the power events, the sprints, the short distance events, the physique of the swimmers in the finals for the 2008 games changed dramatically. The bulkier, stronger power swimmers that weren't so advanced in technique excelled with this new technology. So that changed it. FINA, the international governing body, had opened up this can of worms by allowing it. First, they reveled in the amount of world records being broken. They were falling left and right in every single event across the board. Some of those records still stand. Incredibly talented guys that are so far ahead of the rest of the field. Caleb Dressel, as an example, still haven't managed to break those speed records. Though he's getting close, and though I do believe eventually they will fall, it was a technology introduced that changed the game. And FINA ultimately had to go back and ban the suits, even after these world records were set. So it's a bit of an asterisk mark with those records that were set from that era.
Well, you open up a whole new discussion on the balance, as you mentioned, because balance in swimming also translates to balance in running, with both the sprints and the distance events. Of course, the shoes over many miles will become a factor, but then, you know, there's ideas about some of the things, even with some of the middle distance and sprint events, where shoes and the friction coefficients, et cetera, may have had a mechanical advantage. Before we let you get kind of back to diabetes homeostasis, and I appreciate that you're doing this with a low blood sugar, final thought on when people had the opportunity to be given these special suits ahead of, let's say, whether it be by country and or by other organization that was a sponsored, you know, special access type thing. I don't know how much that these were released at once, or was there a competitive advantage to, you know, going to some of the top athletes, not necessarily, you know, I don't know who those would be, but like, I can see that may have tipped the balance in terms if they're literally rolling these out right before an Olympiad to try out, or in secret in training with certain athletes. Just comment briefly on that, because you might know more than the average person on the other end of technology would know in terms of how that actually goes down.
Yeah, they get suits into the hands of the top athletes sponsored by their company, with enough time that they're able to try it out in practice, and experiment with it, which was the case before the 2008 games. But anybody that had a shot at medaling in those games had access to the suit. Any of the finalists, any of the semifinalists, they all had access to the suit. There may have been, you know, third world countries or something that may not have had access, but their chances of winning a medal, the suit wasn't going to make that difference.
And with regards to you as a personal athlete, knowing the rules, whether it be a substance that you're ingesting or a piece of equipment, where do you think the onus is? Is it with the coaches, or is it with the athlete themselves, or both?
Well, it just needs to be a level playing field. I mean, if a 5-inch sole is better than a 2-inch sole, I don't know, as long as everybody can wear heels in the running race,
right?
let them do it. But you know, I think that my saying was always, it's the swimmer in the suit, not the suit on the swimmer. And but it changed in 2008. It changed my mind on that. That the technology can have a major impact And especially if it negates a technique that takes years and years and years and years and years to hone and develop, and
Yes.
it negates all of that, then okay, then it just becomes a brute strength contest, like shot put or something like that.
That is a great perspective, and I appreciate you sharing that thought. And later I will share with you, Benno's got some great thoughts on the ride of heel toe progression, on how that makes a big difference in developing diabetic ulcers. So off camera later, I'll share that information. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Well, Benno,
Can't wait to hear about it.
Thank you, Gary.
All
Benno,
right.
you had a lot of information too about the tracks. Tell us about the tracks in your mind. What advantage, if any, you saw in Japan with the new track technology?
Yeah, you know, the tracks are basically influenced by the fact that most of these stadiums are used for big concerts, and therefore you have to be able, with big cars and trucks, to drive over them, so you cannot have a very sensitive or critical construction. So the surfaces that you have typically on the track and field stadiums are not very different, and the difference is less than 1%. The difference really can be gained with changing the shoes.
So the shoes is the much bigger magnitude of a factor. Now
The shoes, it has been showed that it can easily have something like 4 or 5% effect.
I had Simon on, and Simon Bartold, and he opined that after talking with some of the Nike people, that perhaps the shape, the rocker, accounted for several percent, that the carbon plate maybe for 1% or 2%, and then there was a third factor. Do you think that and you mentioned too, you have a paper on the teeter-totter effect. What do you think the greatest factor of magnitude is with the new super shoes?
Yeah, nobody knows that. You know, the claims that it is this or this or this is they have not been proven. There was a study that did a study where they cut the plates, and they had the same effect than with the non-cut plates. So it could be that the plates have a different function.
Mm-hmm.
And the material, you know, they claim that material make about 2%. Nobody has shown that. Nobody has done an experiment to do that. So, I mean, what we do at the moment in our lab, we try to understand which are the factors that play a role in these shoes. But nobody knows. And the IAAF, the track and field body, they have made these rules without understanding which factors are that play a role.
Let's go back to some of your seminal work with the changing paradigms, and perhaps you're best known for your theories on tuning and the effect in muscles and injury rates, and then also the preferred pathway. We've got some people that are very experienced that are listening in, and then some more novice, people that are new students to biomechanics, and some people that have no experience with biomechanics. Can you share those two pillar theories of yours that you felt changed, in your view, how we should view running injuries versus the old skeletal alignment dogma that had been perpetuated for years?
Yeah, you know, when I was a young biomechanist, I thought that impact and pronation are the two factors that are the reason for the development of injuries, and wanted to go out and prove that this is true. And when we start with impact, it came to the point that at one point in time, I had to say to myself, I don't find that result. And as a matter of fact, if you go to the literature about everything that has been published about impact forces and injuries, the average is 0%. So there are some that claim there are injuries and some that claim there are no injuries. And if you average the whole thing out, it's basically in the middle.
The meta-analysis, yeah.
And so from a purely statistical point of view, there is no evidence that impact forces are the reason for injuries. Impact forces during running. Now there is another aspect, and that's the aspect of a functional thinking. The forces, the internal forces are determined by the moment. So if you have a force which acts on the forefoot, let's say this is the foot, this is the ankle here, acts on the forefoot, then that force produces a big moment with respect to the ankle joint, which has to be countered by some structures behind the ankle joint, which is the triceps surae. That means you have a big distance when the force is in the front, and therefore you have a big moment, and that big moment has to be taken up by the triceps surae, and the forces in the triceps surae are huge. When you have a force that is close to the ankle joint, that force has a small lever to the ankle joint, and therefore the internal forces produced by this force are small. And that's the fact when you have impact. Impact in heel-toe running has small internal forces. And small doesn't mean 10% less. It means the internal forces through to active forces are about 5 to 10 times higher than the internal forces produced by impact forces. So functionally, there is no reason why we should think that the impact forces produce high internal forces and that are the reason for injuries.
That was a major light bulb that you shared yesterday in our pre-interview, and one that frankly I was not aware of. And I've read a lot of your stuff, but it makes perfect sense with the longer lever arm of what you say of the action on the forefoot as being a key component of something that we might want to look more at. Hence some of the work that was done with Kogler with valgus wedges for plantar fasciitis. I'm sure you have some other thoughts of what consulting you've done with shoes.
Now,
Can you give us an example and expand, please?
That means if you land on the forefoot, you produce these high forces in the Achilles tendon again. And if you land on the forefoot in an asymmetrical way, then these forces in the Achilles tendon are even higher. So one thing may be that you want to change the situation, that you make it more symmetrical. That's an aspect how you can reduce the local loading in the structures of the human body.
So with injury, then I think we will have a position of asymmetry because we're favoring. Can you address that with what the statements that you just made, the implications of injury with asymmetry? Let's say I have a deficient ACL on my left, which is going to affect my gait and other things. How does that then translate with both what you just said, and then also something we might need to consider with your preferred movement path theory, which is sort of that we're going to move towards the most efficient, injury-free pathway I think you translate it mainly to running, but I think it might even apply to other sports as well. Ice skating, skiing, perhaps. So please, I'd like to hear your thoughts on injury and asymmetry, and then how that affects the preferred motion pathway theory that you've developed.
Yeah, let's assume injuries related to loading. If I have high internal forces, I get injuries sooner or later. Let's assume that is true. Now, when we do that, we have two possibilities. One, we can reduce the forces in the structure that we look at, for instance, the Achilles tendon. And the second one, we reduce the asymmetry. Now, these are two different things. If I take off very symmetrically, I have high force in the Achilles tendon. In sprinting, that is somewhere between 5 and 10 times body weight. So the forces are high, but the Achilles tendon is made for that. Now, let's assume I take off being on the outside or on the inside, so being asymmetrical. That means I have a load increase in the already high force in the Achilles tendon. And that increase is something like factors 2 to 10. And of course, if you have that step by step, that may be a reason for injury. So the first thing is to make sure that you get rid of asymmetry, that your walking or running is very symmetrical. The second thing to work on is to make sure that the forces in general are not so high. The first you can achieve by having some wedges in the insole. And by wedging the insole a little bit, you can make that the loading is more distributed to the one or the other side. The reduction of the total force can be done by changing the style, by making shorter steps. When you make shorter steps, you have less forces in the Achilles tendon or less forces in the internal structures at all. And that, of course, is an advantage.
Can you reiterate, just so it's very clear, what the single most important function in your mind of an insole or orthotic? You just mentioned it, but I wasn't. Can you give another example of a modification made in an insole, whether it's forefoot valgus wedging for plantar fasciitis or something else that you think will have the most tangible effect from the studies and research that you've done?
My suggestion would be to make sure that the loading is symmetrical.
Okay.
So when you put an insole in and you make a medial or lateral adjustment, make sure that what you do makes the whole movement more symmetrical.
Always have that as your center line. Let me ask you this. You mentioned an important thing in terms of offloading for both injuries and also for offloading for something like a diabetic ulcer, which we see a lot in the world of podiatry. You mentioned a term called RIDE, which I hadn't heard of before, which is the heel to toe progression. Can you explain for everybody a little bit about the importance of RIDE and how that plays out in some of the things that can be done in shoes and other alterations that we would do to try to help someone with problems with loading?
RIDE is a variable that is basically related primarily to comfort. Ride is defined as the rolling, the forwards rolling of the center of pressure in the shoe. Now let's assume you have a situation where you land like that, you slap down. That means the forward rolling would be fast at the beginning and slower at the end. Let's assume you have a first slapping down of the midfoot and then a slapping down of the toes. Then you would have two peaks of that ride. And you don't want that. You want to have a ride that is basically more or less constant velocity to move forwards, like rolling forwards. And that seems to be related very much to high comfort.
Tell me a little bit about how that may or may not translate to shearing, and is there any groundbreaking things that you can share with us on shearing? I know that that hasn't been your primary focus because you've been more looking at some of the things with tuning vibrations, but can you share, just because you mentioned pressure, is there anything that you think is important to consider with ride and shearing, other than the coefficient of friction with like the socks and things like that?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, in terms of the tuning vibration theory, can you talk about how you came to that sort of epiphany about the importance of tuning muscles? Explain for people what that means in a nutshell, and then some of the applications that you've done because of your muscle tuning theories to try to prevent injuries.
Yeah, you know, when we realized that
How's the
yeah, that's fine. But what we
Go ahead,
do,
we're back. Go ahead and repeat that. I'm sorry. We had some kind of connectivity. Go ahead. When you realized.
what we do when we land on asphalt or on grass, we prepare ourselves differently. Everybody knows that. You know, you don't land the same way as you or in sand as you do on asphalt. You make it differently. And the question then is, why do we do that differently? And one of the possible explanations that we found was that it could be that when you land like that, the soft tissue that are on your body start to vibrate. And you don't like that. So you try to avoid that. And you can avoid that, A, by changing the landing style, or B, by pre-tuning the muscles differently that they don't vibrate that much. So it's like a car that has a damper. When you drive that car over a bump, then the movement of the car is something like that. So it's a damped vibration. And we do something similar like that when we run. So we can adjust the landing, or we can adjust the muscle activity. And that adjusting of the muscle activity we call pre-tuning. And we have some evidence that this takes place. Now, some people have said that that doesn't take place, but nobody has shown evidence that this is not the case.
As far as the idea of tuning shoes to, let's say, specific tissues, because different tissues have different tuning frequencies, like the Achilles tendon has a certain tuning frequency. And I know when I had my discussion with Simon Bartold, he was mentioning that you want to avoid resonance, which would have a similar frequency that could create almost the same effect that you have like on a bridge with the vibration. What are some of the implications of that with some of the consulting work you've done with shoe companies to, quote, tune a shoe to a certain objective, i.e., reducing torque on the Achilles tendon or irritation, for example?
Yeah, we have, when Simon was with Salomon, I worked with him on a shoe that is an anti-tuning shoe or a tuning shoe. And we had some experimental results that were quite substantial. So it makes an effect. The effect is bigger when you run faster. And we have quantified these effects.
Now you talk a lot too, you had an important paper and you made mention of it already, of the importance of muscles crossing the ankle joint as being so important for injury prevention in terms of some of the things that we can take action steps on for our patients. Which muscles in particular you think are the most fruitful for that? And then as a quick follow-up, what about the role of intrinsics? For example, the flexors and the interossei lumbricals in terms of doming exercises for the arch. Those don't cross the ankle. All of them don't. The flexors do, but not the interossei and the lumbricals. Let's say the abductor hallucis. How important are those intrinsic muscles as the follow-up question in terms of injury prevention?
Let's go first to the muscles crossing the ankle joint. One of the problems that we often have is that we use the triceps surae for adjusting the geometry of the joint. Now, this is an expensive strategy because that costs a lot of energy, because the triceps surae always works with big forces and big muscle activity. And if we could, the thought process was, if we could replace the function of the triceps surae with other muscles crossing the ankle joint, and then that would be an advantage. Now, the condition that you can do that is that the other muscles are strong. So we did a study with that MBT shoe, the Masai barefoot technology shoe, which basically makes the whole system unstable and which basically strengthen those small muscles. And we got the effect that those muscles were used more for stabilizing the joint. So the Achilles tendon was unloaded and load was shifted to the small muscles. The shift was earlier, and because the small muscles don't need that much force earlier in the process, it was an advantage with respect to the loading of the whole muscle system. We have done some studies to prove that this is beneficial when you have strong small muscles. We are just now doing a study, a 3-center study together with Finland and Canada, where we have about 600 people exposed to different forms of training for the small muscles, and the initial results are very promising. So the idea basically is that you strengthen the small muscle. By doing that, you change the function of these muscles more as a stabilizer, reduce the internal forces, and a lot of the problems that you have in the foot and knee can be solved by this strategy.
How much benefit do some of the common things that we instruct our patients to do, such as resistance bands for the posterior tib and peroneal, will show them the action of the muscle and the resistive counter direction? How much benefit do you think those movement patterns have for prevention of injuries? Is that enough of a load for stabilization?
I don't know exactly what you do.
So let's say we're taking a resistance band, Benno, against the posterior tib muscle, which
What is that, a resistance band?
so it's like a rubber resistance
Oh,
band.
a band.
Yeah, a band. And we're using that as a resistive force against the agonist action of the muscle. Is that the type of exercises that we should be instructing our patients to do for those muscles crossing the ankle? Are there other things that you think are more beneficial?
No, that's good. That's a good one. The important thing is that you do it in all directions. So you have 3 horizontal direction, forward, sideways, upwards, and you have 3 rotation, adduction, in eversion, plantar and dorsiflexion. So you have to do the whole thing, and you have to do that consistently, the same for all directions. The problem when you do something with the rubber band is that it kind of brings you to do especially one direction. It's all directions that have to be important. But you know, what I do is I stand in the morning on one leg and clean my teeth and go a little bit up and down, not more than about 5 centimeters, 2 inches. And clean the teeth, and the cleaning the teeth makes me unstable. And by doing that, I strengthen those muscles. But whatever you do, you can do it isometrically or dynamically, it doesn't matter, as long as you do it in all directions.
Well, that's a good sort of benchmark. What about for power sports sprinters? In your mind, has there been an overemphasis on things like box jumps? It got very big in the CrossFit community. And I know that that may not be an area that you've studied a lot, but I do know also that you worked with the Cirque du Soleil. So tell us about those types of higher impact and potentially more detrimental activities for the purposes of developing explosive strength.
I wouldn't know the answer to that. The only
One
thing
thing-
that I can tell you that with the Cirque du Soleil, you know, they had a lot of injuries. And the injuries were because the surface was not uniform. So if the surface is not uniform, you are prone to have injuries. So we had a surface that was kind of compliant, but sometimes a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less, replaced by a surface that was completely hard. And the injuries were gone.
Because of the pre-tuning phenomena that you mentioned?
Right.
Yeah. And you also mentioned that that most of the injury is in the propulsive, correct? The propulsive phase. is when the muscle activity is most vulnerable to injury.
When the forces are high
Yeah.
in the propulsive phase, yeah. Nobody has data for that. So there's no publication out there that shows that active injuries are more common than impact injuries. Nobody has done that.
One of the big things.
That's basically a theoretical thinking, but is right.
One of the big things that you sort of debunked is this idea that we knew what was happening in the subtalar joint. And I think that one thing that when I had a discussion with Simon Bartold, he told me that once you exposed what was happening inside the shoe, where you windowed out, let's say, the back of the shoe, I think that's how it was done, you would see that there was internal movements and you couldn't just measure the external axis of the shoe. But then there's controversies about the axes in general with modeling with the subtalar joint. Can you it's a very controversial area, but can you comment briefly on what your thoughts are? Do we sort of chuck Merton root and weed out the window, or what is your thought process on the importance of the axes of the subtalar and metatarsal joints?
The importance is high. What we do, we never determine it because we don't know how to. And that's everybody in the whole world. There are some possibilities to determine the position of the subtalar joint axis in very isolated situations. We have done some experiments in that. But in principle, you cannot use that for walking or running, that these methods don't work. So what we do, we use clinical axis. So we use, for instance, the AP axis. Now the AP axis is not a functional axis. There's no joint corresponding to that. So the movement really happens in the real joint axis, and that's the ankle joint axis and the subtalar joint axis. We are not able at the moment to quantify that.
Do you have any strong opinion one way or the other with lower extremity injuries if the ankle is more responsible than the subtalar, or do you have no opinion on that?
No opinion.
I have a question on tuning, vibration, and kinesthetic feel. When people use, let's say, these compressive sleeves, I'll give you an example of one that don't really have a lot of structure other than the compression. In your mind, is that enough to do anything to the tuning vibrations in the muscle, or is it more of just a kinesthetic effect and awareness that might be helping? Because subjectively, these things can sometimes help people. They'll say it's, they're limping less. And like, this is an example of just a sleeve for the plantar fascia. It's not an ankle sleeve that just has more compression in the area of the fascia. So it's not an orthotic by any means. It's just strictly compression, but segmented towards the focused part. What is your thought on that kind of technology?
Theoretically, I would predict that they have an effect on the vibrations. Practically, we haven't seen it. We have done some experiments with sprinters, with some pants, not only socks, but whole pants, compression pants. And we have measured the vibrations during sprinting, and we didn't realize the difference. So theoretically, I would expect there should be a difference. Practically, I cannot show you the experimental result for it.
How important do you feel that stabilization of the first ray is with respect to things that we are doing with either orthotic intervention or inside the shoe or externally to the shoe? What are some of the things that you think might be most valuable in that effort?
No idea.
Well, we talked about this and you said you might not have an opinion until you actually tried and measured. But this is something I've been looking at for, and I just have it inside the package, but it's got a little polyurethane widget under the first ray. So it's basically a Morton's extension, but it's attached to the foot with a compression
I
band.
didn't see it.
Oh, let me get it again. Let me take it out of the package if I can. Shrink wrap's pretty good, but I got it out. So basically, it's lobster claws
I don't see it.
to the first ray. Let me hold it up higher so you can see it.
Yeah.
And you would, so this would be for two.
Sorry, what is that?
So this is, it's a nylon acrylic stretch sleeve that has a polyurethane, basically like a Morton's extension that helps with conditions like hallux limitus and turf toe. The idea of trying to actually adhere it more to the foot so that as you're moving, it's still attached a little more intimately with the foot. We have Morton's extension pads, of course, that we can put inside an orthotic or inside a shoe, but this is designed to be more intimately attached to the skin surface.
So is that like a kind of sock?
It's like a functional sock sleeve, correct? A functional sock splint, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
And what is the question?
Do you see a role with these kind of things that would be adhered to the foot as something that might help in the stabilization of the first ray? I guess the answer is maybe I have to send you one so you can take a look at it and
I don't
measure
know.
it.
I mean, it's the first time I see that.
Mhm.
And I don't like to just
Right. I know that's good. That's good. Not shooting from the hip. What about carbon plates? That's something that's been around for a while. I've seen some studies that have talked about decreased mid-tarsal joint arthritis out of Australia, decreased joint torques, I suppose, through the mid-tarsus. What do you think about carbon plates for things like hallux limitus? I haven't seen a lot of studies. Functionally, they seem to work and have been used for years by athletic trainers and sports physicians.
Yeah, you know, carbon plates are very much in at the moment. And they are in primarily because of performance. What they do exactly is not clear. You know, there was a study done from Eastern Canada where they took two shoes, both with carbon plates. They cut the carbon plates with a distance of about half an inch or a little bit more, between half an inch and an inch. So they cut that carbon plate about 4 or 5 times. And they measured a lot of different things, among other things, oxygen consumption and movement, and they didn't see a difference. So what does that mean? Maybe the carbon plate has some different functions. Maybe the carbon plate is there to distribute the forces. And that's more important than to build that lever. We don't know yet. We are working on that question. And it also means that the upper of the shoe, or the whole construction of the shoe, produces some of the same effects as the carbon plates produce.
What are some of the things? Go ahead, Benno, finish up, please.
But nobody knows Nobody can give you an answer about that.
I will tell you just experientially, when I've had people that have had, let's say, the recovering from a fracture or a painful hallux limitus situation, that oftentimes, anecdotally, patients will sense relief when we put that in their soccer cleat, that carbon plate. And I think that anecdotal, experiential evidence is part of the equation too, even if we can't necessarily measure and know why for sure. I guess the idea functionally that I'm thinking is that we're limiting the movement, the torque of at that joint level by putting a stiffer component in there. What are you most excited about in terms of the culmination of your life's work and what you have, I guess, on the hopper moving forward? I know that you mentioned you have a grad student that is working on a model for the lower extremity that is getting more and more tuned in, so to speak. Maybe you can share with us a couple of the things that are perpetuating your projects that you think are most interesting and exciting.
So I'll tell you all the things that I'm going to do.
Okay, you're like an old carnival barker. You got to leave them asking for something more for later. Let me ask you this. What advice would you give to the practitioners and the students in the crowd? In terms of learning the field of biomechanics, journals, online things to look at to expand their knowledge. What would you share with them about that process and thoughts on that?
My suggestion is that they shouldn't learn biomechanics. They should learn to think functionally. So the example that I had at the beginning, where I said, if the force acts close to the ankle joint or far away from, everybody can understand when you have big moments that the internal forces are higher. And everybody can understand that if you have small
Froze for a moment.
moments, the idea about instability and the small muscles that are crossing the ankle joint. Everybody can understand that if you use the small muscles to stabilize instead of the big triceps surae, that the internal forces are lower. And that's what I mean is functional thinking. That whenever you have a question, you say, what should happen mechanically? When you say, for instance, that sock with that insole inside, is that something that is good or not? Now, what does the sock do? What do you think is the function of this structure that you put on the foot? And if you cannot understand the function, why should you do it? So think functionally. That's the most important thing.
What are you doing I like to ask my guests what they're doing to maintain their own health with exercise. You mentioned some balance drills that you do while you're just brushing your teeth. What else, what's your primary form of exercise these days?
I work out.
Walking, running?
No, strength training.
I hear that's very important for testosterone, strength training
Very
for
important
males.
for old people.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to allow.
Strength is the most important part.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, if you have a problem, a good colleague from mine, he was a vice president with Nike. He told me, I have problems with my shoulder. What should I do? And I told him strength training. And he said, what? I have pain. And I said, it doesn't matter. do strength training. And he did strength training, and 3 weeks later, he didn't have any pain anymore.
Yeah, those support muscles are building that external armor probably around this point of weakness.
Strength training in 6 directions, 3 translational and 3 rotational. And exactly the same thing. That's especially for me as an older person, it's very important. And of course, the pandemic was not the best thing to support that.
Well, you've been very generous with your time tonight, Benno. I have a couple colleagues out there. If anybody wants to ask the godfather of biomechanics a question, you've got him right here. Anybody have any questions? I see Dr. Pribbett there. He was on a feature that he had his own shoe blog and very knowledgeable and studies a lot in biomechanics. Dr. Pribbett, Steve, do you have a question for Benno before we sign off?
I would ask a quick question to Benno about his knee replacement, which happened, I guess, about a few years ago. And then they did a varus or valgus osteotomy to make things more perfect. And he talked about developing osteoarthritis in his hip.
That's a great thing to bring up, Steve. I'm glad you mentioned that. Benno, can you share with us your experience? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
Benno said, if something isn't broke, don't try to fix it. But I wonder if it increased asymmetry and if the limb was longer. So if we had either gait asymmetry develop after.
Okay.
So that problem is solved, but it was completely unnecessary.
Right.
I have a former postdoc of mine, Dr. Hinterman. He has just been identified as one of the top orthopedic surgeons of the 10 top in the world. And he is a foot specialist. And we talked about that quite a bit. And he supports me in that thinking that don't fix it if it isn't broken. You know what the human body does? We try to get a solution for our body. And this solution tries normally to minimize the forces in the system. That's what we do. And if we start to fiddle around and interfere, then the question is, does that help? And I would suggest it usually does not help. So I have my left foot is toed outward and the right foot is straight. So I'm not symmetric in that sense. But that's just because nobody fiddled around with the left foot and somebody did it around with the right leg.
There's not very much in the human body that is meant to be perfectly straight.
That's right. We are not symmetrical. I mean, you know, to have symmetry with applying a force is something else than claiming that the whole construction is symmetric. These are two different things.
Well, not to throw surgical solutions out the window totally, but I remember a cop that told
No.
I know you're not suggesting that.
I mean, you know, my knee joint that I had surgery on, I have an Oxford knee, which is a cover of the remainder. So it's not a complete knee replacement. It's just something that goes over the joint. And that was a fantastic idea to do that like that. But that was good. The problem just that he wanted to do something more.
Right. You know, I've heard stories of people that have had ACL deficiencies and developed compensatory strategies that work for them that never had to have surgery. as long as they're not doing stuff like, you know, the Olympic decathlon or something of that nature, when they're just
And,
going through their activities of daily life.
before they getting old. When you get old, you lose the strength to stabilize, and then you have a problem.
Well, that's a great point, and this is a very important discussion piece. If, let's say for my deficient ACL, I've got that vastus medialis developed now. If I'm keeping up with activity, am I going to have a problem when I start losing muscle mass, or because I have been developing it through my life? And if I continue to some degree, that may be enough, or is it just situational in your mind?
I would suggest that you will have a problem.
Interesting. Well, I guess time will tell.
I
Time
say
will tell.
keep working on it and don't give up.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but the problem is, you know, that once you lose strength, so for instance, when I did the hip, I lost hip strength. And in a certain age, it starts to become very difficult to get the strength back. Much more difficult with 80 than with 60.
And yet we see athletes like Tom Brady that are doing things that George Blanda was never able to do. George Blanda of the Oakland Raiders. I mean,
Yeah, but he's in his 40s.
yeah, I mean, so
Yeah.
that's true. That's
we
true.
have-
There's a couple more decades ahead of him. Well, Benno, listen, thanks again. And before we sign off, do any of the students, or does anybody else have a question? You've got the world-renowned Dr. Benno Nigg, and there's not going to be a lot of opportunities to have these kind of forums. So speak your piece now. He's still going to be plugging away probably for the next decade, but this is a great opportunity if anybody has a quick question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something. First of all, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's such a pleasure to listen to you. I'm a former professional ballerina, so listening to how you were talking about working on your small, again, and also I'm a first year podiatry student, so excuse me if I don't use the right terms, but when you're talking about using, like, strengthening your small muscles in your foot, that was really, really true in my experience in dancing, and that helped me, I think, to strengthen my ankles, and is taught a lot within the dance world to do that. So yeah, thank you very much for that. One of my questions, again, kind of relating to dance, because that's where my background is when you jump off your feet, is it better to, like, have your heels all the way down onto the ground and then jump from that? Or like some styles of ballet, for example, teach you to not land your heel all the way onto the ground and just kind of jump from the middle of your foot? Like, what in your experience would you recommend to jump from the whole foot, or like jump from kind of mostly the mid to toes?
That's like asking, is it better to land at the heel or land with the forefoot? Both is okay. It's just that you load different structures. And in your case, I mean, I can imagine that in certain dance movements, you never get down with the heel to the ground. So I in principle, that's not something that is bad. You can do it the one or the other way, but both can be done properly.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Is there anybody else that has any other questions? And while you're thinking for a minute, I did want to let people know that this interview, Benno, will be published next year in podiatry management. So people will have an opportunity to read an abridged text of this, and maybe I can get Dr. Privet to help me edit it, because there's been a lot of discussion. Anyone else have any other thoughts? And if not, I'm going to have you, Benno, give the last word, and then we'll say goodnight.
Functional thinking.
Benno, thank you so much. It was a great evening. Did anything you wanted to say after that?
Functional thinking.
Okay.
It works in all regards. Benno, it was good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Thank you, Benno.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.